This week's episode of the And She Looked Up podcast is brought to you by Fine Lime Designs. If the name sounds familiar, that's because it's my design business and the work I do there helps make this podcast possible. If you love colorful and whimsical art prints, greeting cards, and journaling stickers, then head over to my Etsy shop for a delightful browse. Just search for Fine Lime, like the fruit, designs, all one word, on Etsy, or click the link in the show notes. And now, on with this week's episode. Welcome to the And She Looked Up podcast. Each week, we sit down with inspiring Canadian women who create for a living. We talk about their creative journeys and their best business tips, as well as the creative and business mindset issues all creative entrepreneurs struggle with. I'm your host, Melissa Hartfield, and after leaving a 20-year career in corporate retail, I've been happily self-employed for 12 years. I'm a graphic designer, an illustrator, and a multi-six-figure-a-year entrepreneur in the digital content space. This podcast is for the artists, the makers, and the creatives who want to find a way to make a living doing what they love. Hello, everybody, and welcome to another episode of the And She Looked Up podcast. As always, I'm your host, Melissa, and this week my guest is Dr. Christina Neigel, and I'm super thrilled to have her here today because we're going to be talking about community libraries and what a hidden resource gem they are for working creatives. And that's not the only reason I'm thrilled to have her on the show. I'm also really happy to have her here because she's one of my oldest and dearest friends. Welcome to the show, Christina.
Oh, that's so kind of you. Thank you. I'm happy to be here.
I am happy to have you here. So for those of you who do not know Christina as well as I do, just to give you a little heads up on who she is. Christina has a master's degree in library and information studies and a doctorate in education, with a focus on post-secondary leadership. And after nearly 20 years teaching undergraduates at a small regional university here in BC, she is now moving. Well, actually, I think you've moved, have you, to a new role?
I'm in transition. To a new role as a university librarian, where she intends to continue the hard work needed to decolonize herself, her practice, and her workplace. She once wrote a textbook on the Dewey Decimal System, which I think we all remember from elementary school. Fueled by the many jokes that work spawned, she thought she would write her dissertation on library stereotypes in today's popular culture. She would like everyone to know that nothing has changed. For fun, she likes to start art projects, mostly painting and lino-cut printmaking, and sometimes she even finishes them. And she's being a little hard on herself there because those of you who have seen my studio walls, several of the pieces on those walls belong to her. She has indeed finished them. So, Christina, one of the first questions I ask everybody who comes on the show, and I always have a little bet with myself about how they're going to answer, and to be very honest, I actually don't know how you're going to answer this, so I'm curious to see. But did you identify as a creative when you were a kid? Oh, you don't know.
No.
Yeah, I really, really did, actually. And I absolutely loved visual arts, and I loved writing. And I think in the end, by the time I got to maybe junior high school, I felt like a lot of my creativity had kind of been soundly beat out of me. So I know in my earlier years, I really felt myself as a budding artist, but I have this really pragmatic side of my brain, and maybe I was influenced by my pragmatic family. So I always knew that was going to be sort of that creative element was going to happen in tandem with some other occupational goals. So I ended up not pursuing it in the way that now at the age I am, I would like to pursue it. So yeah, I really did. So I'm finding that person again.
Yeah, I mean, I've always thought of you, I think of everybody as creative. And I find it really interesting because I do know your family well, and there's a lot of creative people in your family, and yet you're like those interesting people that, and I don't mean this in in a bad way, but there's those people who are kind of equal brained. Do you know what I mean? Like you're very creative on the one side, but you're also, like you said, very practical, very pragmatic. Some people definitely lean more to one than the other, but you are very strong on both those kind of arms, I guess, is what I'm trying to say.
Well, and I've been thinking a lot about this. I heard a talk a couple of months ago that really made this clear to me, that there are those people who want to turn their creative passions into everything that they do. And so they build businesses out of that creativity. And I heard one example of, she was a visual artist who did paintings and became a tattoo artist, and then was able to merge the two passions by having a gallery in her tattoo parlor.
Oh,
and
that's a good idea.
I realized that that is not me. And in fact, being asked to bring that passion into my working life would be really difficult for me and would maybe take the joy out of it. So ironically, I am most productive with artwork when I am most frustrated with work. But when work is going well, I find my need to suspend time and immerse myself into art wanes. So I just discovered that about myself. So it's kind of interesting, yet I know underneath the surface, right, that all informs how you think and how you solve problems and how you create solutions to things. So I know it's still constructive and it's still operating in the background, but I don't think I could be one of those people who is able to bring that directly into their livelihood in the same way.
It's very different. I think creating for a living, which I do, and creating because it's an outlet or a passion are two very different things. And I think even people who create for a living really need to have a creative outlet that is not monetized, like you need that escape. You need that escape hatch. And it's just interesting what you said about how you are most productive with art when you're frustrated with work, because I think it becomes almost like a form of procrastination in some ways.
It does. Well, and for me, I find it is very, very similar to meditation.
Yes.
So that idea of letting go of the idea of chronos time and being able to live in the moment.
Yeah.
And that happens when I'm having some successes with whatever project I'm working on, and suddenly 8 hours of your day has disappeared and you weren't even aware of that passage of time, but you were so immersed in what you were doing. And there is something that fills your cup when you engage in that. And I really wish that everyone could experience that, but so many people talk themselves out of thinking that they can be creative or artistic even, and yeah. It's such a shame.
It is, I think, because they think they're not good at it. The thing is, you don't need to be good at something to be creative, right?
Yes.
You just have to enjoy it.
I know this firsthand.
And I think sometimes if you lean to be a type A or something, or you're somebody who picks things up easily, picking up a creative skill, which is different from being creative, can be really frustrating if it doesn't come to you quickly. And so you think, I'm not good at this, I'm not creative, which is all a load of crappy stuff. But yeah, so you did not follow a creative career, but instead you went a different route, which I think actually still plays into your love of writing a little bit, but we can get into that later. So you went down the road of becoming a librarian. We all have, it's interesting you wrote your dissertation on this, because we all have stereotypes of librarians in our head. So you're going to, I hope, enlighten us a little bit on what it is that librarians actually do first. Because what we're going to get into, everybody, is we're going to be talking about how your local library and other types of libraries can be tremendous resources as working creatives, both from an inspiration standpoint, from a community building standpoint, from a research standpoint, and it's all free, which is really cool. So we're going to be talking about that. But before we do that, Christina, maybe you could tell us a little bit about, first of all, what it is you do as a university librarian, and then maybe we can get into more about what community librarians do, because I believe they're different.
Okay, so a quick tour around my career. When I was finishing up my undergraduate degree, so I was working on a major in history, and I had taking lots of archaeology courses, and I had this idea that I wanted to work in what we call now the GLAM sector. So that's galleries, libraries, archives, and museums. And I did some work experience in museums and quickly realized that really libraries was one of the few places that you could generate a livable wage. And I was raised, lots of credit to my mom, who wanted me from day one to be able to earn a living that allowed me to do whatever I wanted as an independent human being. And so I was always really mindful of that. So I came across something called a library technician diploma, and I was at the time didn't feel ready to do a master's degree. And I think a lot of people don't know that libraries are actually pretty hierarchical workplaces, and there's most of the front-facing people that folks interact with in a library, like in a public library, will actually be library assistants or library technicians who may have a high school education, a diploma, they might have a bachelor's degree, but a lot of librarians, if we use the capital L, have a master's degree. And so I eventually worked my way into getting a master's degree, but I started off as a library technician working in like a public library, and I moved into special library work, and then I became a librarian and became an academic librarian, and then landed in a teaching position and became a librarian who taught undergraduate library technicians. And so it's actually kind of a weird career compared to most librarians who spend most of their career working in the actual library, where I worked more so in a university academic context. And so this new role that I have as university librarian has taken me out of my teaching role, and now I will be leading a small regional university's library, and that means that I not only manage employees working in the library and supporting their work and providing service, but that I'm also participating in the senior leadership team for the academic institution and trying to find ways of using that immense capital of library as a space, because most universities, as folks know, have like their library is a center point. Often it could even be an architectural center point for a campus. And so there's a lot of real estate that those facilities use, as well as what they contain, right? All those resources they contain. So my role will be sort of this dual role of supporting that staff, but also finding ways of connecting with community. For example, a lot of academic libraries will do joint projects and ventures with the local public libraries to provide maybe a one-off program, or serve a specific gap that bleeds into both the community that the university or the college serves, but also the broader community of that region. So that's kind of what I'll end up doing. But of course, the tension is that there is so much that could be done. And one of the things that libraries in Canada, I think, are really leading the way, both in public and academic, is trying to reconcile the fact that they are colonial institutions born out of Western colonial views on knowledge and how information gets disseminated and used and who gets to use it. And this emerging understanding that there actually are other ways to know and understand the world, and how do libraries fit into making more space for those non-colonial perspectives. And that's going to be the real challenge, I think, for me and my colleagues over the next several years.
That's so interesting. So does that include things like maybe finding a way to bring oral histories and oral stories like into part of the resources that you provide?
Well, yes, and that's what's so fascinating, is because for those of us, and I include myself in this, as coming from a white settler middle class background, is that it's hard for many of us with those backgrounds to even conceive that there are other ways for knowledge to be shared and transmitted and developed. So those coming from oral cultures, for instance, view storytelling as not just a form of entertainment, but a way of actually sharing histories, ways of doing things that has been pretty much downplayed and even ignored or sabotaged by, prevalent white culture. So those are the things that I think libraries are wrestling with now, is how do we incorporate that without taking it over, right? So that's something too that is part of that heart work of acknowledging that I have a very specific perspective that misses a lot of those important things. And how do you listen to your community and talk to the right people to find out what they want out of their local libraries? We don't decide that for them. We present ourselves as, we're a resource that you might have interest in working with or not. And if the answer is no, then we have to honor and respect that. And that, I think that's really hard for, dominant white culture, is to accept that some other cultures may not see it as appropriate to share, and we're not privy to maybe their internal cultural practices. So yeah, so that storytelling one is a good example, and oral histories is another example that libraries have engaged with and collected oral histories. Vancouver Public Library has done this, for example, but who gets to access them and how, and who got permission to collect those stories in the first place? Like, there's a whole lot to unpack in doing that work.
Yes, it's fascinating, actually. I find it really fascinating. It's one of the things I've always really loved about libraries, is how they do make an attempt to reflect, and I'm talking about public libraries here, particularly in smaller communities where I am, how they do try to make what they offer reflect the community that they serve. I wasn't being very articulate there, but hopefully
no I understood. Well, and one thing I do want to say, because I find this an endless source of amusement, is that I do believe that popular culture teaches us a tremendous amount about what we assume about the world. And my research in that area showed that libraries are repeatedly framed in the past. So often past that never actually even existed. So people think libraries equal books, equal study spaces, equal quiet, equal the gatekeeping librarian who maybe is unlikable, or alternatively, the librarian who just needs to be released from their old maid prison because underneath it they're like these sexually repressed women. Those are the most fun to explore, actually. But
she just needs to take off her glasses and let her hair down.
That's right. Yes. And it still surfaces in very, very contemporary pop culture. So I find it both troubling and amusing. We still see references to card catalogs and stamps in children's picture books, and in movies. I'm thinking like it was Night at the Museum. So in Night of Museum, there's several scenes with the archivists, and you see card catalogs down there. And I find it laughable because, of course, my children and even folks older than my children never grew up with those things. So they only know them through this repetitive symbolism in pop culture. And the reality is that libraries actually spend most of their budgets on electronic materials and staff. So libraries have space, they have people, and they have information resources that and usually lots of computers and all of those things. But that's not what we see in that popular culture. So and it educates us on what we think about libraries. So when you ask people who know nothing about libraries, they continue to say, what does a librarian look like? And you hear it, right? It's the glasses, it's the hair done up in the bun, it's the cardigan. Yeah. So it's still there.
So let's talk about that. Let's talk about, like, we all know if we go down to our local library, we can get books, we can get DVDs, maybe CDs. Does anybody do that anymore? I don't know.
Yes, they do.
Do they? Okay. Okay, so that's great. What else can you do?
Yeah.
That's what everybody thinks of, right? But if you spend a little bit of time in the library looking around, even just at the posters on the wall and by the door when you walk in, there's actually way more stuff that's available. So if you have a library card somewhere in Canada today, tell us a little bit about some of the things that we could find in our local library that we may not expect to see there, or that might surprise us.
So what is so thrilling about what we have in Canada, and and even from British Columbia's perspective, because that's what I'm most familiar with, is that every province has a library act, and so they're mandated by government to provide public library access on some level. And that's usually funded through municipalities. That's why there's so much variability between libraries and what the buildings look like, who works in them, that kind of thing. And but fundamentally, we've all become really expert at sharing resources for the minimum amount of financial output, because
if you look at your property taxes every year,
that's right,
what you pay, so you'll see the police and fire department are way up at the top, and then school is probably next, and then there's a whole bunch of things, and then right at the very bottom is libraries, and it's like maybe $10.
Yes, exactly. So but we do this at our peril, actually, because I think people get a sort of a misconception of how much it actually costs to run libraries. And the biggest costs, again, are electronic resources and the staff. And it honestly drives me crazy when we talk about libraries as being important, when in fact it's the people who work in them that are important, because they make sure that those spaces function as they need to, and that there are actual things in them managed in a way that are accessible. So I take the view that libraries operate as the platforms to community engagement. And in doing so, they have all these services that you can access that people may know a little bit about or not. So one example is libraries as exhibition space. So because they are a physical space that are often our only public spaces left next to outdoor parks, they can become like a cultural hub. And so they work very well often as being exhibition space. Note, though, that when you make choices about what gets displayed, you are opening yourself up to potential controversy over the choices being made of what is being displayed. But some examples that I think folks might find interesting is Richmond Public Library in the fall opened an artist wall for local artists to showcase their art. So it becomes an accessible way to show your artwork. And so it's not necessarily that these are award-winning, well-known artists, but in fact just local members of the community who have, by some miracle been satisfied with one of the projects they've created and are willing to share it with others. And then you have, in an academic library setting, like the Wewa Library at UBC, which is an Indigenous library branch of University of British Columbia. They have an exhibit with cultural displays around residential schooling. So it's intended to be more instructive than maybe purely visual eye candy like you see in other exhibits. And then, Canada has more than 250 art libraries in Canada. And one example is the Montreal Museum of Fine Arts. So you can go with, highbrow art or maybe community art. And there are rotating exhibits that you might see in libraries. We had one at the institution I worked at that was the art of the book. And so it was people doing interesting artistic things, mostly paper art with books, which is so cool to bear witness to. Absolutely amazing how you can chop a book up and make it into something. Now, and I find that amusing because my daughter thinks it's terrible that I fold corners down on books. So,
are librarians allowed to do that? Are you?
Oh, yes, I believe in writing in books as well. Preferably not library books, but there is something about writing in the margins of books, maybe in pencil, and the legacy that your notes leave for the next person. So when I was doing my doctorate, I actually loved it when other students wrote notes in the library books that I was looking at, because they would put their own little interpretations in the margins of what they were reading, and it gave me ideas.
Yes, you just shot me right back to university with that. I'd forgotten about that. Yeah.
Now I'm not endorsing it because I might get in trouble with some people. But I actually do think that there's value in, they call it marginalia. So libraries as exhibition space is one example, but there's also research support. So Vancouver Public Library has an example of fee-based support for businesses called Info Action. So if you're starting a small business, you can actually utilize research support from the librarians who work there to help get you started. You can also access things for free, but obviously you're going to get, it's going to be reliant on your abilities to wade through materials.
Right.
Where
I had no idea they did that. That is so interesting.
Yeah, they've done it for actually quite a long time, and you can access it, the information on their website about how it works. But yeah, so they have that. Other libraries like Fraser Valley Regional Library has a license to something called Creative Bug. Mm-hmm. It's all one word. And it's an art and craft how-to videos. And most people are familiar with lynda.com. A lot of public libraries will have licenses. I think it's now called LinkedIn Learning, but they'll have licenses for that as well. And you may not necessarily get your certificates out of it when you go through them, because that's a different licensing model, but you still have access to the instructional videos and help. And then there are more in-depth scholarly materials that, can be extremely valuable, like the Art and Architecture Source database, which is like one of the largest full-text art research databases available, and it covers fine, decorative, and commercial art. So it really depends on what you need. If you're looking for inspiration, you might use the short story index that helps you get into works, because it's really hard to find. Like, if you have in your mind that you just want to read short stories, how do you find those short stories if you don't know specific authors? So, that might appeal to people who are trying to model and develop some of their writing skills. So there's the research support, and then there's programming, which is what a lot of librarians actually work very hard at developing. And that could be having workshops. There's lots of teen programming out there for young people, learning how to draw anime, write poetry, do animation. The Boston Public Library has something called the Incubator Program for creatives, and they have basically it's a fellowship that people can access. I think it's up to $20,000 to support their pursuit.
Oh, wow.
Their artistic pursuit. And then there's these ideas of folks in residence. Yeah, so libraries have really taken up this model quite frequently, and it's the idea of an expert of some sort in residence. So writers in residence, you may have heard, artists in residence, storytellers in residence. I think Calgary Public even has a composer in residence and a songwriter in residence. And they often, they'll be paid for their service, and they'll do very specific performances or presentations as part of maybe a theme for a given period of time. We've had Indigenous, so elders in residence at public libraries, so they might do storytelling. They might be present for a significant Indigenous events and dates. And it's marvelous because it offers folks like a venue in which to celebrate these aspects of creation, and provides the ability to invite the community around a specific practice or skill or direction. And I think it's really powerful because it allows communities to tap into the expertise that may be living in their communities. So it creates a forum or a platform for discussion. And so I think that kind of programming is something a lot of folks maybe don't fully appreciate or aware of from their libraries. So academic and public libraries often do that kind of programming.
Yeah, I think a lot of us think of library programming, we think of children's read-alongs and things like that. Like, we tend to forget that there's programming for adults, and you mentioned teens. Yeah, but so here's the thing. How do you find out that what's going on at your local library? I think, and I'm somebody, you mentioned the Fraser Valley Regional Library System, and that's the library system that I fall into, being a small suburb of Vancouver, and I follow them on social media, and because I use the library a lot, and I still, like, some of the things you talked about there, I had no like access to, like, an arts database. Is that something I would be able to get access to through my community library? Like, how?
Yes, and you see, this is the real challenge, is folks are inundated, through social media and just the general state of the world by different possibilities and options for everything. Yeah. There are so many things that can tap into your very limited recreational and available time. And so it requires, I think, folks to tune in to their community a little bit more. And maybe that is something that this pandemic has revealed to us, that we have to be more intentional with where we want to spend our time and get our information and whatnot. So all libraries have websites now. Like, they just all do. And even the ones that have almost no money to spend on even a website belong to consortia that allow them, a backbone website development team to access and develop those things. So even the tiniest of libraries will have a website. And on those websites, for the most part, they not only allow you to search the library catalogs, which are increasingly filled with electronic media,
Mm-hmm.
um, they will also have links to things like online learning or online resources. And under those kinds of tabs, you'll find access to databases. How they frame it will vary from library to library, and that's where you need to spend a little bit of time on your community's website to figure out where it is. And you know what? If you can't find it, the other thing is libraries are full of people who want to help. So you just call them or email them, and they'll point you to those things. So in my case, because I had used my academic institution's resources for so long, I couldn't find my library card when my public library card when the pandemic hit, and I wanted to subscribe to Acorn TV, which I could get free through my public library,
They
which
took
is
that
all
away. It's gone
yeah.
now.
I,
Anyways, but yes, I was very excited
I'm
about
sorry.
that too.
I'm sorry. I wasn't in the decision making.
I know, but I'm
know.
sad it's gone.
So I had to email the library and say, I don't know where my card is. I don't have my code on the back. Please help me. And of course they were able to accommodate me, and I got in and got what I was looking for. But the interesting thing about, you mentioned CDs and things, is that DVDs are still wildly popular in libraries. People, not everyone, much to, I guess, folks' surprise, can afford streaming media services or even cable vision. So you will be amazed at how much some of those materials are used. It's absolutely incredible, actually, the volumes that people use for that. So now libraries are moving towards trying to get licenses to streaming services for their members who may not be able to afford those things on their own. Mm-hmm. And let me tell you, these resources are outrageously expensive. And it is a concern that I have thought a lot about in terms of how we sustain this, as more and more of our ability to access materials is limited by increasingly restrictive copyright and digital rights management, policies and legislation. So that's something that libraries have to grapple with. We no longer have things we buy and then share with you. We actually have to rent them ourselves to share with you. And that is not ownership. And I think folks maybe don't appreciate what the compromise is when you don't own something anymore. So that is something, when you look at your tax statement, you think about how much libraries get out of the pie in their municipalities and how much they probably need to meet the growing demands of their communities. Those numbers usually don't line up nicely the way you want. That's why you don't have Acorn TV to access anymore. Like, something's got to give, right? And that's what happens. There's just one other thing I wanted to mention was in terms of things you can get out of libraries, because I think this one is probably really appealing to some of the folks who listen to your podcast, and that is maker spaces. So it's, it's the term we use right now, but sometimes it's innovation spaces or creative spaces. And these are kind of intentionally designed lab space physically in libraries. There may be digital versions of them to some extent as well. And the idea is you can access resources to allow you to create because you can't afford them maybe on your own, or you're not sure which materials you want to invest in yet, so you want to play with some stuff. So Vancouver Public Library and a lot of the big urban libraries have fairly expansive lab space or maker space. VPL's is called the Inspiration Lab. And they have rooms for you to do audio and video recording with green screens and cameras and mixer boards, and you can plug in your musical instruments and do recording sessions. They have workstations with things like all the whole Adobe Photoshop and Illustrator suites. you have to book them,
Mm-hmm.
and you usually have to be a resident of that community to access those bookings. I think they've been called creation stations, and there's all kinds of names. And all it does is allow you to access equipment that you might not either be able to afford or might not have an intensive enough need to, buy those things. A really cool one for some of us who are maybe a little older is being able to take like your old camcorder video recordings and digitize them.
Oh,
So
that
they
is
have
really
the
cool. Yeah.
yeah. So you can put bring your tapes in and literally rip them into digitized format, because you're like, what am I going to do with this home video from 30 years ago?
Well, even just stuff that your parents or your grandparents might have
Yes.
filmed and that you just want to see what's on them. And so that's really cool.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And
So there's, I know there's the Inspiration Lab in Vancouver, and Toronto calls it the Digital Innovation Hub. And those are available in really urban centers.
yes.
But are we going to start seeing more of that? And I know it comes down to money, but are there more scaled down versions of that are starting to pop up in smaller communities? I'm just thinking of my little tiny library, and
Yeah,
what would be available in
Yeah.
there.
Okay, so Quesnel, BC has a makerspace in their public
Oh,
library.
cool. I used to live in Quesnel. That's cool.
Yeah, Sheep River, Alberta has a makerspace.
Awesome.
School libraries also, some of them have maker spaces. So for the younger folks, they might have access, and which is really cool, because I think that helps young people grow up with an expectation that these services should be available to them. So, and I think that's why young adult programming is so important, is that families bring their kids into the library when they're young. I mean, lots of folks say those were great opportunities for their kids to experience a story time, or and then when those kids end up going to school and they can read for themselves, adults stop reading to them, even though we all love to be read to. I mean, the audiobook industry is doing fairly well. So when we have young people, teenagers, and that's often when they have such huge competition for their time through their other extracurricular activities, thinking about ongoing education, like their time is really tapped. And it is also a time where we can support and cultivate like this appreciation for the public sphere, and the idea that you don't have to spend your own money all the time to develop your skills, but you can actually meet other people who are like-minded, and also want to develop skills together in these community spaces. And I really think if you're in a community where your library doesn't have some of these things, it really is, the onus is on the local citizenry to demand it. And that may mean that your municipal taxes need to shift a little bit, like you need to pay another $1 a year towards your library. But governments respond to need when they see that need. And so, that need stems from the citizens they're supposedly representing. So I do think that we should all have an expectation that libraries are resourced to allow these things to maybe even grow more than they have. It is amazing what libraries can offer based on the size of the budgets that they actually have. When you know that it is expensive to pay people to do the work, like that's a huge, huge part. And I'm a big a believer in labor and supporting people in their roles. And so I do believe that libraries have been undervalued for well over 100 years. I think it's informed by the fact that people see it as a women's profession. And I think it's been, a field that is just fundamentally always struggled to make ends meet. And yet what they offer communities is so profound. there's a real disconnect there that I think folks need to be mindful of. And I don't know, maybe have a stronger opinion about when you go to your, your local municipal elections and demand more for these spaces. So some libraries, like Surrey Public Library, I know has done, they call it an economic, like they've tried to look at an economic impact that their libraries have on their community as a way of it explaining to people those impacts. I don't think you need a report or you need to scientize it to know that people who feel connected to their community, whether it's on social media and in the digital world or in a physical way, like that is critically important to us as human beings. So I do think there's always opportunity to make library spaces better and bigger because they will make the communities better and bigger. you know
Yes, I think one of the things, if you're listening, one of the things you can do is actually go to your library. If you haven't been for a long time or you don't know where your library card is, go check out what your local library has to offer. I go to mine regularly and they always have something going on that's interesting. And Christina, you just told me about a bunch of things that I had no idea even existed. So I'm definitely going to be checking out for those. I think some of the other places where you can find a little bit of inspiration as an artist is not like one of the things that I use a lot is going back and looking through magazine archives for visual inspiration. And I've also done it for content inspiration. When I was in the content creation space, I would go back 2 or 3 years and see what they were talking about 2 or 3 years ago and how I could put a twist on it as something slightly new. So there's ways there. And I think another thing that we always forget about is that as creatives who run our own businesses, and we're always looking for new streams of revenue or new ways to become immersed in our community and become part of the local fabric, is those maker spaces we were talking about. Maybe your library doesn't have all the fancy stuff, but I guarantee you they have a meeting room where you could teach a class or bring people together to do. I mean, I remember going to a slideshow in my local library once from some guy who had been on some, I can't even remember what it was, but he'd been on some expedition or something. And he was doing a slide presentation of where he had been. And I don't think I had gone to the library with the purpose of seeing that, but it was on and I stuck my head in the door and it was really interesting. I wound up sticking around. So like those kinds of things happen all the time. Maybe not right now because of where we are pandemic wise, but there's opportunities there to become really involved. I live in a community that has a very big South Asian population. My local library, up until the pandemic, did poetry readings in Hindi regularly. It was like a weekly thing, and I think it was a drop-in. You could come read your poetry. They also did Bitch and Stitch programs once a week where you could go in and you could knit or crochet or whatever with a bunch of other people who were knitting and crocheting and like basically anything where you were stitching. And would you necessarily think of those things if you're looking to reach out and meet other people within your community or bring people to you or teach a skill or something? And I don't know how that works. I think if you're teaching in a library, you wouldn't generally charge. I think it's meant to be open to the community.
Yeah, and every system has its own set of policies on how to manage a lot of those things. But, I also would really want to encourage people who are creating things and want to share those or their experiences. If they don't see themselves or what they do reflected in their local public library, it may just be a simple matter of reaching out to that library and having some discussions about what is not there. And I think it speaks again to how libraries have to decolonize as well, even though they are inherently colonial institutions. There's a certain irony in that. A lot of folks don't know that public libraries way back in their early days were instruments of assimilation, and that's what they were intended for, like to help bring newcomers up to speed on how they are to integrate themselves into their new culture. Whereas now we have to shift our thinking into being, it's more about inviting difference. And if you don't see that reflected in your local community library, part of it, the onus again is on the community to ask for those things, or to help the people who work in the library know where those gaps are. And lots of libraries hire folks specifically to do like community-led librarianship, where they go out to the community and find out what is needed. But the other problem libraries have is that they are predominantly white, middle-class folks working in them. So how their knowledge about the world is framed is inherently problematic. So it might require the community to kind of push a little bit and have some articulated expectations about what they'd like to see reflected in those spaces as well. And it's, it's like everything, it's a negotiation of what is possible. But it is exciting. Like I think there's lots of neat possibilities, and it's a weird time to be in libraries, but I've been doing this for 30 years now, and I feel like it's always a weird time to be in libraries. So maybe that's just the nature of the beast.
I do have one more question for you before we wrap it up to the hour. And we talked a little bit earlier about academic and specialty libraries, so like university libraries, colleges, government libraries, that kind of thing, which have always kind of struck me as only being accessible to either the people who work there or the people who attend there. And does the general public have access to those? Like if you're doing deep research into a project, like, I don't know, maybe you're designing costumes for a play or something, I don't know, and you want to go back and you want to do some really deep research into a specific era and what they wore, or things like that. Is there a way to gain access to those facilities for the general public?
It is such a good question to ask, and because it is so poorly, I don't want to say advertised, but poorly marketed to communities. So if you are a graduate of a post-secondary institution, you are an alumni of that institution, and most of those institutions offer some kind of alumni access to their library collection. So it may be limited in that you have to go on site to access some of the proprietary databases, but you can do it. You may be able to have what they call a community borrower's card. As an alum, often they waive the fees, so it's free. You just have to ask for one. And it allows you to borrow books, but it may not allow you to access those databases because, again, those private corporations that rent us those things get to decide who gets access based on what price you're paying. So it could be extraordinarily expensive to offer it to every graduate from that institution, right? So a community borrower's card. Then there's your public libraries can do something called interlibrary loaning. So various libraries have different rules around their capacity to do this. So they all participate, but they may not go to the ends of the earth to try and find you what you need because it's just cost prohibitive.
Right.
So if UBC has a book that you want, but you're not a grad of UBC, you're not a student, but you really, seems like the only place that has it, you can go to your local public library and you can ask them to request on your behalf, and you get it on loan through that system. You might not have it for a long, long time, but it might be enough. So that's another mechanism. The thing folks need to know too is that when you're accessing online resources that are paid for by the library and are restricted to only members of that community, you will probably need like the barcode on your library card or to set up an account to access those materials remotely. So another reason why you need that library card. But most people don't know, for instance, that I think most residents of British Columbia should be able to access consumer reports for free through their library, which means every time your dishwasher breaks and you have to buy a new one and you want to know what the latest and greatest are before you spend big bucks, you can actually find that out through the library, and you don't have to pay through Consumer Reports website to get that information. And I find like that's the thing people get the most excited about is Consumer Reports.
Yeah, actually, I was just doing research yesterday because I need a new printer to print my art prints and greeting cards. And, well, now I'm going to go look on Consumer Reports at Epson EcoTanks and see if...
Right? Yes, exactly.
So yes, it doesn't have to be your dishwasher. It could be your art printer. It could be your new computer. Yes. So.
And if you don't know how to search or you're not finding what you want, then you email, text, call your local library, and I assure you someone will help you find it.
That's awesome. So this is one of the things we all forget about, is that there is this gem sitting in your neighborhood with so much inside of it, whether it's physical or digital, that you have access to with just a library card, and it's free and it's amazing. And I think we really only scratched the surface of what we could have even talked about here. And I will just say, my local library just put a call for artists out because they are opening up their gallery wall now that, I mean, my library was open for pretty much the entire pandemic. You could go in. But now they're encouraging people to come back in, and they're doing a call for artists. So that's another thing. Keep an eye out for those things, because that's a great way to get your artwork displayed. It's a great way to get known in your community. It's a great way to bring people to you in your community through their spaces. And there's just a wealth of inspirational material that's available. And as you mentioned, there's some extremely knowledgeable people working in those buildings.
Yes, I like to think so. That's for sure. Interesting, knowledgeable, sometimes quirky. Yeah, and definitely people focused. That's certainly what I taught from a good portion of my career. Is I'd have folks come into class and they're like, well, I really like to read, so I want to work in a library. And I'm like, yeah, but do you like people? Because you don't actually get a lot of time to read on the job, I'm afraid to say.
No, but yeah, there's always cool things. My local library did a Lego exhibit recently, which was really cool. And they invited all the kids in the community to create Lego creations. I'm a Lego freak, so
that is so awesome.
I thought it was really cool, and they were all displayed in the library. So yeah, there's a little bit of something for everyone, which I think is one of the amazing things about libraries. And they do truly try to make all of this as accessible to the entire community as they can. One more question I'm just curious about is, if people wanted to volunteer, like, is there a mechanism out there to volunteer for your local library or to donate to your local library?
Oh, I'm glad you asked. So as a labor
that was not on our prepared list of questions,
no,
by the way.
As a labor person, the first thing is that most libraries in Canada are unionized, and therefore volunteering can be a challenge. If you wanted to volunteer at a school, you can help out the local school library, but I have lots of complicated feelings about volunteers. They have good intentions, but don't have the resident expertise often.
I was thinking more of from a perspective of helping out with like actual programming. Like if you are like, you know what, I have a skill that I could bring to the neighborhood. Is there a way that I could run a program through the local library? Like, I don't know, maybe you're a watercolor artist, or you are maybe you teach creative writing. I don't know.
Yeah, I think the key, if you want to participate, in an activity or become part of an activity for a library, ideally it's just reaching out to the branch manager or, someone who works in the library to find the right fit and then figure out whether what you identify is practical,
right,
and something you can get off the ground. But I do think, like, a lot of libraries have friends of the library groups. So they're like a community group that liaises with the library and might share their insights into what might happen with the library. Every library system kind of functions a little bit differently.
right.
So it's just navigating that to find out. But and some may have very formalized programs where you submit an application to be considered. But my strategy for a lot of these things is picking up the phone and just reaching out until you get bumped along to the right person to direct your question to. So I think there's always interest. It's just a matter of who you need to talk to make it possible. And then there's, for young people, there's often teen advisory groups that run in libraries. So one staff person will manage the teen advisory group, and they'll liaise and say, hey, young people, what do you want to see in the library? And work with them, instead of deciding for them, which I think none of us particularly appreciate, right?
Yes, absolutely.
So, yeah, that's what I would suggest. Just pick up the phone and start asking.
Well, that's just it, and we talk about that a lot we talk about relationships and research on this podcast a lot. And sometimes to form a relationship, you have to just pick up the phone or ask the question. Because the worst that can happen is they just say, no, not at this time, or no, we don't do that.
Yeah. Exactly. Yeah.
Awesome. Well, Christina, thank you so much for coming on today. And I really do hope that everybody listening, if you haven't been in your local library, please go visit it. They're amazing. I love mine. I was so excited when I saw that Creative Bug was available in my library. That's a great one for creatives if you want to learn a few new skills. It's very similar to like Skillshare or Craftsy. There's tons of those kinds of creative online learning places now. So that's really cool. But there's so much there that you probably aren't even aware of that could really potentially help you down the road. Okay, well, that actually, before we go, Christina, I know you're a librarian, and so a lot of the people who come on here have, social media platforms and everything, and that might not apply to you, but where can people connect with you if you're available to be connected with?
Probably, yeah. Well, you can just put my name into Google, and I'm all over the place. Not by design, but probably easiest through Twitter, actually. So my handle is @coast_librarian. That's probably, if people want to direct message me or anything they can through that. But I have a WordPress blog that's sadly a little in need of care and attention. And my email address, my updated email address, will be available on the web as well. And you can reach out to me even through that address. So people don't seem to have trouble finding me if they really want to talk to me. But right. I have a closed Instagram account,
Yeah, no, I know you're very private about social media, so I was trying to word that in a way.
I know. Well, and it's mostly because all those years teaching, it would be students reaching out to me,
it's very different.
And how I express myself in some of those formats may not cross over into the working world cleanly. So.
It's a slightly different world than most of the people who come on the show. So.
That's right, where they want to share widely, right?
But anyway, yes, so that's where you can find, I'll put links to all of this in the show notes. So if you want to get in touch with Christina, let's just say right now that Twitter is probably the best way. So thanks so much for being on this show. And thank you to everybody for listening this week. We will be back next week with another brand new episode, and we will talk to you all then. Thanks, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us for the And She Looked Up Creative Hour. If you're looking for links or resources mentioned in this episode, you can find detailed show notes on our website at andshелookedup.com. While you're there, be sure to sign up for our newsletter for more business tips, profiles of inspiring Canadian creative women, and so much more. If you enjoyed this episode, please be sure to subscribe to the show via your podcast app of choice so you never miss an episode. We always love to hear from you, so we'd love it if you'd leave us a review through iTunes or Apple Podcasts. Drop us a note via our website at andshелookedup.com or come say hi on Instagram at andshелookedup. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next week.